The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla walked through the empty corridors, her footsteps echoing against the ancient stone walls. It had been 3 months since Queen Elizabeth II's passing, and the palace still felt hollow, as if the very soul of the monarchy had departed with her. The staff moved like ghosts through halls that once buzzed with purpose and tradition. Camilla clutched her morning tea tighter as she made her way to the Queen's former private study. King Charles had been in Scotland for the past week, dealing with urgent matters concerning the royal family's estates, leaving her alone to navigate the complex web of royal duties and palace politics. The weight of the crown jewels seemed nothing compared to the invisible burden she carried as the new queen consort. The morning newspapers lay scattered across the mahogany desk, their headlines screaming about constitutional crises and political upheaval. Parliament was in deadlock over new legislation. The Prime Minister had called for emergency sessions, and rumors of internal conflicts within the government dominated every front page. Camilla had learned to read between the lines of these reports, understanding that each political tremor sent shockwaves through the monarchy's carefully maintained stability. As she settled into the leather chair that had once been Elizabeth's sanctuary, Camilla noticed something peculiar. The morning briefings from the private secretary's office were unusually sparse. Normally, her schedule would be packed with meetings, ceremonial duties, and correspondence that required her immediate attention. Today, however, there was an eerie silence from the administrative wing of the palace. She pressed the call button for her lady-in-waiting, but no response came. The intercom system, usually bustling with activity and coordination between departments, remained silent. A growing sense of unease crept over her as she realized that the familiar sounds of palace life, the gentle murmur of staff conversations, the clicking of heels on marble floors, the distant ring of telephones, were completely absent. Camilla rose from her chair and walked to the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds. The normally immaculate gardens showed signs of neglect, with fallen leaves scattered across pathways that should have been swept clean hours ago. The ceremonial guards, who typically maintained their stoic positions, were nowhere to be seen. Even the ravens that traditionally roosted in the castle towers seemed to have vanished, leaving behind an unsettling quiet that made her skin crawl. Her mobile phone had no signal, which was unusual given the palace's excellent communication infrastructure. The landline phones produced only a steady dial tone when she attempted to reach the various departments within the royal household. It was as if the entire support system that kept the monarchy functioning had simply evaporated overnight. The realization hit her gradually, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The strange absence of staff, the lack of communication, the unusual quiet. Something significant was happening beyond the palace walls. She remembered the late Queen's words about times of crisis, how the monarchy must remain a steady beacon when the nation faced uncertainty. Elizabeth had often spoken about the importance of maintaining dignity and composure, especially when chaos threatened to overwhelm the established order. Camilla made her way to the palace's main communication center, hoping to find answers or at least establish contact with the outside world. The usually busy room filled with monitors, phones, and radio equipment stood empty. Computer screens flickered with unread messages, and red warning lights blinked on various communication devices. It became clear that whatever was happening extended far beyond a simple staffing shortage or communication glitch. She tried to access the palace's secure television feeds, which typically provided real-time news updates and emergency broadcasts. The screens showed only static or emergency broadcast signals, suggesting that normal television programming had been disrupted. The few channels that did function showed hurried news anchors delivering fragmented reports about widespread communication, failures, and government officials being rushed to secure locations. The gravity of the situation began to dawn on her. This wasn't just an isolated incident affecting the palace. It appeared to be part of a much larger crisis affecting the entire country's infrastructure. The absence of staff suddenly made sense. They had likely been evacuated or recalled to deal with emergency situations affecting their own families and communities. In the growing twilight of what should have been a routine day, Camilla found herself truly alone in one of the world's most significant royal residences. The palace that had housed monarchs for nearly 1,000 years now felt like an empty shell, its grandeur overshadowed by an ominous sense of abandonment. The portraits of previous kings and queens seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as if they understood the magnitude of the crisis she was facing. She thought about Charles, somewhere in Scotland, possibly dealing with similar isolation and uncertainty. The communication breakdown meant she had no way of knowing his status or coordinating their response to whatever emergency was unfolding. The monarchy's strength had always come from its unity and coordinated response to national crises. But now she felt completely cut off from the very systems designed to maintain that unity. As darkness began to fall over Windsor Castle, Camilla realized that she might be witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented in British history. The late Queen had prepared her for many challenges, but nothing quite like this complete breakdown of normal governmental and communication systems. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever as she contemplated what the morning might bring, and what role she would need to play in whatever crisis was engulfing the nation. The palace's emergency lighting system activated automatically, casting long shadows through the corridors and creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. Camilla knew that somewhere within these ancient walls lay the tools and symbols of monarchical power that had guided Britain through its darkest hours. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight belonged to uncertainty and the growing realization that she might be the only remaining link between the crown and whatever remained of the established order outside these walls. Dawn broke over Windsor Castle with an unnatural silence that made Camilla's heart race. She had spent the night in the Queen's former chambers, unable to sleep as she listened for any sign of returning staff or communication from the outside world. The emergency lighting had flickered throughout the night, suggesting that even the palace's backup power systems were under strain. As she made her way down to the kitchens, hoping to find some basic provisions, Camilla discovered that the palace's main food storage areas had been sealed off. Emergency protocols she never knew existed had apparently been activated, leaving only minimal supplies in the smaller pantries. She managed to prepare simple tea and toast, but the act of cooking for herself in the vast royal kitchens felt surreal and somehow symbolic of how dramatically her world had changed overnight. The morning news broadcasts, when she could access them through the palace's emergency radio system, painted a picture of widespread chaos across Britain. Reports spoke of coordinated cyber attacks on government infrastructure, mass evacuation of key personnel from London, and the activation of emergency protocols not used since World War II. The Prime Minister's office had gone silent, Parliament had been suspended indefinitely, and emergency services were operating on limited capacity. What struck her most was the complete absence of any official statements from Buckingham Palace or other royal residences. The monarchy's voice, which traditionally provided stability and reassurance during national crises, had been effectively silenced by the same forces disrupting the rest of the government. She realized that millions of British citizens were probably looking for guidance from the Crown, but the institution's communication channels had been compromised along with everything else. Camilla attempted to access the palace's secure communication systems, using codes and procedures that Charles had shared with her during their briefings on emergency protocols. Most systems remained offline, but she managed to establish brief contact with security personnel at other royal properties. The reports were universally grim. Buckingham Palace had been evacuated, Balmoral was operating under lockdown conditions, and communication with government officials had been completely severed. The most troubling news came from her attempts to reach Charles in Scotland. The security team at Balmoral reported that the king had departed 2 days earlier for what was described as an urgent security briefing, but his current location was unknown. The communication breakdown meant that even the Royal Protection Services were operating with incomplete information, unable to maintain the coordinated security network that typically surrounded the royal family. As the morning progressed, Camilla began to understand that she might be the only senior member of the royal family with access to the historical symbols and documents housed at Windsor Castle. The realization brought both terror and a strange sense of purpose. The late Queen had often spoken about the monarchy's role as the ultimate guardian of British constitutional traditions, especially during times when normal governmental functions were compromised. She made her way to the sections of the castle that housed the most significant royal artifacts and documents. The crown jewels had been moved to more secure locations years earlier, but Windsor still contained items of immense historical and constitutional importance. Ancient charters, royal seals, and ceremonial objects that represented centuries of British legal and political tradition were stored in climate-controlled vaults beneath the castle. The security systems protecting these areas were among the few that remained fully operational, suggesting that whoever had orchestrated the broader attack understood the importance of preserving certain symbols of state continuity. Camilla's biometric access, established after her marriage to Charles, allowed her entry to areas that would normally require multiple authorizations from palace officials and government ministers. In the vault's subdued lighting, she found herself surrounded by objects that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the signing of treaties that shaped world history, and the coronations of monarchs who had faced their own unprecedented crises. The weight of history felt almost physical in this space, where the abstract concept of monarchical authority took tangible form in crowns, scepters, and ancient documents written in languages that predated modern English. Among the collection, one item drew her attention with almost magnetic force. The sword of state, a ceremonial weapon that had been present at every coronation since the 14th century, rested in its specially designed case. Unlike many of the crown jewels that were primarily symbolic, this sword represented the monarch's role as the ultimate protector of the realm and its constitutional order. The sword's history was tied to moments of crisis throughout British history. It had been present when monarchs faced civil wars, foreign invasions, and constitutional upheavals that threatened the very existence of the crown. The late Queen had mentioned it during one of their private conversations, explaining how it symbolized the monarchy's duty to maintain constitutional stability, even when other institutions failed. As Camilla examined the ancient weapon, she noticed that its case had been recently accessed. Someone with the highest level of authorization had visited this vault in the past few days, though the security logs had been corrupted by the same cyber attacks affecting other palace systems. The discovery added another layer of mystery to the unfolding crisis and suggested that the current emergency had been anticipated by someone within the royal establishment. The afternoon brought new challenges as the palace's power systems began to fluctuate more severely. Emergency generators maintained critical functions, but non-essential systems were being automatically shut down to preserve power for security and communication equipment. The vast castle, designed to house hundreds of staff and guests, felt increasingly oppressive as Camilla realized she might be its only human occupant. She attempted to venture outside the castle grounds, hoping to gauge the situation in the surrounding town of Windsor. However, the palace's security protocols had automatically sealed all exits, responding to whatever threat assessment was driving the broader emergency response. She was effectively imprisoned within the very symbol of British monarchical power, cut off from the subjects she was supposed to serve and protect. As evening approached, Camilla found herself drawn back to the vault containing the Sword of State. The weapon seemed to represent not just historical continuity, but also the weight of responsibility that the crisis had placed squarely on her shoulders. She was beginning to understand that whatever resolution emerged from this chaos might depend on decisions she would have to make alone, without the guidance of advisors, government officials, or even her husband, the king. The third day of isolation brought unexpected visitors to Windsor Castle. Camilla was awakened before dawn by the sound of vehicles approaching through the main gates. Her heart raced as she peered through the heavy curtains, seeing a convoy of black cars with government plates moving across the courtyard under the cover of darkness. After days of complete isolation, any human contact felt like a lifeline, even though she couldn't identify who these mysterious arrivals might be. Within minutes, her solitude was broken by voices echoing through the corridors below. She could hear footsteps moving with purpose through areas of the castle that had been empty for days. The sounds were both reassuring and alarming. While she was no longer alone, the manner of their arrival in the early hours suggested urgency that might herald even worse news about the crisis. Engulfing the country, a knock at her chamber door announced the presence of Sir Marcus Kellaway, the deputy private secretary, whom she hadn't seen since before the communication breakdown began. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, with rumpled clothing and an exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights dealing with unprecedented challenges. Behind him stood two individuals she didn't recognize, dressed in the sort of nondescript suits that suggested intelligence or security services. Sir Marcus explained that the government had been operating from secure locations for the past week, coordinating a response to what they now understood to be a sophisticated attack on Britain's entire governmental infrastructure. Foreign intelligence services, working with domestic extremist groups, had launched coordinated cyber and physical attacks designed to paralyze the country's ability to function. The goal appeared to be creating enough chaos to forcing fundamental restructuring of British political institutions. The most shocking revelation was that several senior government ministers had been arrested on suspicion of treason. The investigation had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy to use the national crisis as cover for implementing radical changes to the constitutional monarchy. The plan involved forcing the king's abdication during the emergency, claiming that the monarchy was an obstacle to effective crisis management, and establishing a new form of government with severely reduced royal authority. Camilla learned that Charles was safe, but had been moved to an undisclosed location after intelligence services discovered credible threats against his life. The conspirators had planned to eliminate or neutralize key members of the royal family, making it easier to claim that the monarchy was unable to fulfill its constitutional duties during the national emergency. The attack on government communications had been designed to isolate the royals from their traditional support networks and advisors. Sir Marcus explained that her presence at Windsor Castle had become crucial to the government's counter-strategy. The palace's historical and symbolic importance made it the ideal location for demonstrating the monarchy's continuity and resilience. However, they needed her to participate in a carefully orchestrated plan that would require her to take actions no queen consort had ever been asked to perform in British history. The intelligence officers revealed that the conspirators were planning to announce the monarchy's effective dissolution at a press conference scheduled for the following day. They would claim that the royal family had abandoned their duties during the national crisis and that emergency powers needed to be transferred to a temporary Republican government. The plan depended on the public's inability to hear any contradictory message from legitimate royal or governmental sources. Their counterplan required Camilla to make a public broadcast from Windsor Castle, using emergency broadcasting equipment that would override the compromised communication networks. The broadcast would demonstrate that the monarchy remained functional and committed to serving the British people during the crisis. More importantly, it would expose the conspiracy and rally public support for the legitimate government's efforts to restore order. However, the plan came with enormous risks. The broadcast would reveal her location to the conspirators, potentially making Windsor Castle a target for more direct attacks. Intelligence services believed they could provide adequate protection, but they couldn't guarantee her safety. Additionally, the constitutional implications of a queen consort making such a broadcast without the king's direct approval were unprecedented and potentially controversial. The most crucial element of the plan involved the sword of state that Camilla had been drawn to repeatedly over the past few days. The intelligence officers explained that the sword's presence in her broadcast would carry deep symbolic meaning for those who understood British constitutional history. It would signal that the monarchy was prepared to defend the realm's constitutional order against all threats, internal and external, just as it had during previous national crises. Sir Marcus revealed that the late Queen Elizabeth had actually anticipated this type of crisis in her final years. She had established secret protocols for maintaining monarchical authority during catastrophic breakdowns of normal governmental functions. These protocols had never been tested, but they provided legal and constitutional frameworks for actions that would otherwise be considered impossible within the British system. The weight of the decision felt crushing. Camilla understood that accepting this responsibility would fundamentally change her role within the monarchy and potentially alter the institution itself. The broadcast would establish precedents that could affect the Crown's future relationship with Parliament and the British people. If the plan failed, she might be remembered as the queen consort who presided over the monarchy's final destruction. As the morning light grew stronger, Camilla found herself standing in the same vault where she had contemplated the sword of state just hours earlier. Now, however, the ancient weapon represented not just historical continuity, but an active choice she had to make about the monarchy's future. The intelligence officers waited respectfully at a distance while she wrestled with a decision that no amount of royal training had prepared her for. The irony wasn't lost on her that Elizabeth, who had spent 70 years on the throne, had prepared for this moment of crisis but hadn't lived to face it herself. Instead, the responsibility had fallen to Camilla, who had only recently assumed the title of Queen Consort and was still learning to navigate the complexities of royal duty. The late Queen's wisdom and preparation would guide her, but the ultimate decision and its consequences would be hers alone. Looking at the sword of state, Camilla realized that this moment would define not only her own legacy, but potentially the entire future of the British monarchy. The weapon that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies was about to play a role in the most unconventional and dangerous royal duty ever undertaken. Her next words would either save the crown or mark the beginning of its end. The decision came to Camilla not as a moment of dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty that settled over her like morning mist. Standing in the vault surrounded by centuries of royal history, she understood that this was exactly the kind of moment the monarchy existed to face. The institution had survived civil wars, world wars, and constitutional crises precisely because someone had always been willing to bear the unbearable weight of duty when normal systems failed. She informed Sir Marcus and the intelligence officers that she would make the broadcast, but on her own terms. The message would be delivered from the throne room at Windsor Castle, with the sword of state prominently displayed, but she would write her own words rather than reading from a government-prepared script. The monarchy's independence from political interference had to be maintained even during this unprecedented crisis, and her message needed to reflect her own understanding of the Crown's constitutional role. The next few hours transformed Windsor Castle into a hub of carefully controlled activity. Technical specialists worked to establish secure broadcasting equipment, while security teams swept every room and corridor for potential threats. The castle's ancient walls, which had provided defense against medieval armies, now sheltered modern equipment designed to penetrate the electronic siege that had isolated Britain from normal communications. As preparations continued, Camilla received additional intelligence briefings that painted an even more disturbing picture of the conspiracy. The plot extended beyond British borders, with evidence suggesting coordination with foreign powers, seeking to destabilize the Western Alliance. The attack on the monarchy was part of a broader strategy to weaken democratic institutions across Europe and North America, using Britain as a test case for tactics that could be deployed elsewhere. The conspirators had specifically targeted the period following Queen Elizabeth's death, calculating that the transition to King Charles would create vulnerabilities in the monarchy's public support and institutional continuity. They had infiltrated government communications networks months earlier, positioning themselves to exploit any crisis that might arise. The cyber attacks and physical disruptions were designed to create the very emergency conditions they claimed made the monarchy obsolete. Most troubling was evidence that the conspiracy included members of Parliament, senior civil servants, and even some within the royal household staff. The coordinated nature of the attack suggested years of planning and the involvement of individuals with intimate knowledge of how British governmental institutions functioned. The betrayal felt personal to Camilla, who was learning that people she had trusted were working to destroy the very institution she had sworn to serve. Sir Marcus explained that the legitimate government was simultaneously conducting arrests and securing evidence while preparing for the counter-broadcast. The timing was critical because the conspirators' press conference was scheduled for that evening, and any delay in responding would give their false narrative time to take hold in the public consciousness. Once people began to believe that the monarchy had abandoned its duties, restoring confidence would become exponentially more difficult. The technical team completed their setup in the throne room, installing cameras and broadcasting equipment that seemed almost sacrilegious in the ancient chamber. However, Camilla recognized that this blend of medieval tradition and modern technology perfectly represented the monarchy's ability to adapt while maintaining its essential character. The throne room had witnessed countless moments of historical significance, and today would add another chapter to its story. As afternoon faded into evening, Camilla prepared for the broadcast with the same ritual precision that royal protocol demanded for state occasions. She chose clothing that would convey both authority and accessibility, avoiding excessive formality that might seem disconnected from the crisis facing ordinary citizens. Every detail mattered, because this broadcast would likely be scrutinized more intensely than any royal speech in modern history. The Sword of State was positioned carefully behind the throne, its ancient steel catching the carefully arranged lighting in a way that emphasized both its beauty and its symbolic power. The weapon that had been present at coronations now stood ready to defend the constitutional principles those ceremonies represented. Its presence would communicate to those with knowledge of royal traditions that this was no ordinary address but a moment of fundamental constitutional importance. Minutes before the broadcast was scheduled to begin, Camilla received an encrypted message that had been successfully transmitted from Charles's secure location. The king expressed his complete confidence in her judgment and formally authorized her to speak on behalf of the crown. His words carried both legal weight and personal affection, reminding her that she was not facing this challenge alone despite the physical isolation. The message also contained strategic intelligence that would guide her broadcast. Government forces had successfully arrested several key conspirators and secured evidence of foreign involvement in the plot. However, the public announcement of these arrests needed to be coordinated with her broadcast to maximize their impact and prevent the remaining conspirators from implementing contingency plans. As she took her position in the throne room, Camilla felt the weight of every monarch who had faced moments of existential threat to the institution. The painted portraits of previous kings and queens seemed to watch approvingly as she prepared to defend the principles they had embodied. The late Queen Elizabeth's presence felt particularly strong, as if her spirit was guiding the words that would soon flow from her successor's lips. The red recording light activated, and across Britain, emergency broadcasting systems began overriding normal programming to carry a message from Windsor Castle. Television screens that had shown static or propaganda for days suddenly displayed the familiar grandeur of the throne room, with Queen Camilla seated regally but naturally, her presence commanding attention without appearing intimidating. Behind her, the Sword of State gleamed in the carefully arranged lighting, its symbolism immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with British constitutional history. This was not just a speech but a visual declaration that the monarchy remained strong, prepared and ready to defend the realm against all threats. The ancient weapon spoke of continuity stretching back centuries, while the modern broadcasting equipment demonstrated the crown's ability to adapt to contemporary challenges. As Camilla began to speak, her words carried across a nation hungry for leadership and reassurance. The conspiracy that had sought to silence the monarchy's voice was about to discover that they had underestimated both the institution's resilience and the determination of those sworn to protect it. The broadcast that would either save or doom the crown was finally underway. Camilla's voice carried across the airwaves with a clarity and authority that surprised even her. The words flowed naturally as she addressed the British people directly, acknowledging the crisis they faced while assuring them that the monarchy remained steadfast in its commitment to serve the nation. She spoke of the coordinated attacks on British institutions, the arrests of those involved in the conspiracy, and the Crown's determination to protect the constitutional principles that defined their democracy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes of the broadcast beginning, social media platforms that had been darkened by the cyber attacks began flickering back to life as government forces regained control of communication networks. Messages of support for the Queen Consort flooded in from across the Commonwealth, with citizens expressing relief that the monarchy remained functional and committed to defending their way of life. More significantly, the broadcast triggered a chain reaction among government officials and civil servants who had been waiting for a clear signal from legitimate authorities. Police forces across the country began implementing arrest warrants that had been prepared in secret, while military units moved to secure critical infrastructure that had been vulnerable to further attacks. The Queen Consort's words had provided the constitutional authority needed to activate emergency protocols that restored governmental function. The most dramatic moment came when Camilla addressed the planned press conference, where conspirators intended to announce the monarchy's dissolution. Speaking directly to the camera with the Sword of State gleaming behind her, she declared that any such announcement would be an act of treason against the crown and the British people. Her words carried legal weight that transformed the conspirators' planned media event from a political statement into evidence of seditious activity. Intelligence officers monitoring communication channels reported that the broadcast had completely disrupted the conspiracy's coordination. Many of the remaining plotters, realizing that their plan had failed and their actions would now be viewed as treason, began surrendering to authorities or fleeing the country. The psychological impact of seeing the monarchy not only surviving, but actively leading the counterattack, proved devastating to their morale and organization. As the broadcast continued, Camilla revealed details about the foreign involvement in the conspiracy that shocked viewers and international observers. The evidence gathered by intelligence services demonstrated that hostile foreign powers had invested years in developing networks within British institutions, using the transition period following Queen Elizabeth's death as an opportunity to strike at the heart of the constitutional monarchy. The revelation transformed public perception of the crisis from a domestic political dispute into a matter of national security and sovereignty. Citizens who might have been sympathetic to criticism of the monarchy now understood that they were witnessing an attack on Britain itself, orchestrated by enemies seeking to weaken the country's democratic institutions and international standing. The international response was equally swift and supportive. Commonwealth leaders issued statements affirming their continued allegiance to the crown, while allied nations offered assistance in tracking down conspirators who had fled British jurisdiction. The broadcast had not only saved the monarchy within Britain, but had strengthened its position across the entire Commonwealth realm. However, the most powerful moment of the broadcast came when Camilla spoke about the late Queen Elizabeth's legacy and the continuity of monarchical duty. She explained how Elizabeth had anticipated this type of crisis and had prepared protocols for maintaining constitutional stability even when other institutions failed. The revelation that the broadcast itself was implementing the late Queen's emergency plans added profound emotional weight to her words. Standing to conclude her address, Camilla moved to the sword of state and placed her hand upon its ancient hilt. The gesture was unprecedented in modern royal communications, but its symbolism was unmistakable to anyone familiar with British constitutional history. She was invoking the monarch's ultimate responsibility to defend the realm, not just from foreign enemies but from internal threats to the constitutional order. As the broadcast ended, the transformation in Britain's situation was immediately apparent. Communication networks that had been compromised for days suddenly functioned normally. Government websites came back online with official updates, and emergency services resumed full operation. The conspiracy's technical advantages evaporated as legitimate authorities regained control of the systems that had been compromised. The hours following the broadcast brought a cascade of arrests as law enforcement agencies, now operating with clear constitutional authority, moved against the remaining conspirators. The evidence gathered over the previous days proved overwhelming, with documented communications revealing the full scope of the plot and its foreign connections. What had begun as a sophisticated attack on British institutions ended as one of the most comprehensive counterintelligence operations in modern history. Sir Marcus and the intelligence officers returned to Windsor Castle as heroes, but they found Camilla remarkably calm, given the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. She remained in the throne room, still wearing the formal attire chosen for the broadcast, but now examining the sword of state with new understanding of its significance. The ancient weapon had once again played its role in defending the realm, though in a manner its original makers could never have imagined. The immediate crisis was over, but Camilla understood that the implications of her actions would resonate for generations. She had not only saved the monarchy, but had fundamentally altered the institution's relationship with the British people and the international community. The broadcast had demonstrated that the Crown could provide leadership during the most severe constitutional crises, even when traditional governmental structures failed. As reports arrived confirming the success of operations across the country, Camilla felt the weight of responsibility shifting from crisis management to the longer-term task of rebuilding trust and stability. The monarchy had survived its greatest challenge since the English Civil War, but the victory had come at the cost of revealing vulnerabilities that would need to be addressed to prevent future attacks. The sword of state which had seemed like a museum piece just days earlier, now felt like a living symbol of constitutional duty. Its presence in the broadcast had communicated messages that words alone could never have conveyed, connecting the current crisis to centuries of monarchical responsibility for defending the realm. The ancient weapon had proven that some symbols retain their power, precisely because they represent principles that transcend temporary political arrangements. As night fell over Windsor Castle, Camilla finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that days of isolation and responsibility had created. The immediate danger had passed, but the work of restoration and reform was just beginning. The monarchy had survived, but it had also been forever changed by the events that had forced a queen consort to stand alone against forces seeking to destroy the institution she had sworn to serve. The morning after the broadcast brought King Charles back to Windsor Castle, his return marking the beginning of a new chapter in the crisis that had tested the monarchy's very foundations. His reunion with Camilla in the throne room was deeply emotional, as both understood how close they had come to losing everything they had sworn to protect. The king's first act was to examine the sword of state that had played such a crucial role in the previous night's events, running his fingers along its ancient blade with new appreciation for its symbolic power. Intelligence briefings revealed the full scope of what had been prevented. The conspiracy had planned to use the manufactured crisis as justification for implementing radical constitutional changes that would have reduced the monarchy to a purely ceremonial role with no real authority. Foreign intelligence services had invested millions in developing the network of collaborators, viewing the weakening of the British monarchy as a strategic victory that would destabilize the entire Commonwealth system. The arrests of prominent political figures sent shockwaves through Westminster and beyond. Several members of Parliament, including a former cabinet minister, were among those charged with treason. The investigation revealed that the conspiracy had penetrated multiple levels of government, from senior civil servants to junior staff members who had provided access to sensitive communication systems. The breadth of the infiltration explained how the attacks had been so precisely coordinated and devastatingly effective. International intelligence agencies provided evidence that similar operations were being planned against other Commonwealth realms and democratic allies. The attack on Britain had been intended as a proof of concept for tactics that could be deployed against Canada, Australia, and other nations where constitutional monarchies provided stability and continuity. Camilla's successful counter-broadcast had not only saved the British crown but had potentially prevented a cascade of institutional attacks across the democratic world. The public response to the revelations continued to evolve as more details emerged about the conspiracy's foreign connections. Citizens who had initially viewed the crisis as a domestic political dispute now understood they had witnessed an attack on national sovereignty orchestrated by hostile foreign powers. Public support for the monarchy reached levels not seen since the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, as people recognized the institution's role in defending democratic principles. However, the crisis had also revealed institutional vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. The ease with which conspirators had infiltrated government communication systems highlighted the need for comprehensive security reforms. Charles and Camilla worked with intelligence services to develop new protocols that would prevent future attacks while preserving the openness and accessibility that characterized British democratic institutions. The role of the sword of state in the counter-broadcast became a subject of intense academic and political discussion. Constitutional scholars noted that Camilla's gesture of placing her hand on the ancient weapon had invoked legal principles dating back to medieval times, when monarchs personally led the defense of the realm. Modern legal experts debated whether her actions had created new precedents for monarchical authority during constitutional emergencies. Some critics argued that the broadcast had exceeded the traditional bounds of constitutional monarchy, giving the crown too active a role in political affairs. However, these voices were largely overwhelmed by recognition that extraordinary circumstances had required extraordinary measures. The alternative, allowing the conspiracy to succeed, would have been far more damaging to democratic institutions than the monarchy's temporary expansion of its public role. The investigation into the conspiracy revealed disturbing details about how the plotters had planned to exploit the period of mourning following Queen Elizabeth's death. They had calculated that public emotion and institutional uncertainty would create opportunities to reshape British constitutional arrangements permanently. The discovery of these plans added a deeply personal dimension to the crisis, as it became clear that the conspirators had sought to dishonor the late Queen's memory while destroying the institution. She had devoted her life to serving. Charles announced a comprehensive review of royal security and communication protocols, acknowledging that the monarchy needed to adapt to new types of threats while maintaining its essential character. The review would examine everything from cybersecurity measures to emergency succession procedures, ensuring that future crises would not leave the institution as vulnerable as it had been during the recent attacks. The Commonwealth response to the crisis strengthened ties that some had predicted were weakening in the modern era. Leaders from across the Commonwealth realms expressed renewed commitment to the institutional links that bound their nations together, recognizing that the attack on the British monarchy had been an attack on their own constitutional systems. The crisis had paradoxically strengthened an institution that critics had claimed was becoming obsolete. Camilla's role in resolving the crisis fundamentally altered public perception of the Queen Consort position. Previously viewed as largely ceremonial, her decisive leadership during the emergency demonstrated that the role carried real constitutional significance. Royal historians noted that no Queen Consort in British history had ever faced such a test or responded with such effectiveness under pressure. The psychological impact on Camilla herself was profound but largely positive. The experience of standing alone against forces seeking to destroy the monarchy had given her a deeper understanding of the institution's importance and her own capacity for leadership. The woman who had once been uncertain about her place within the royal family now possessed unshakable confidence in her ability to serve the crown and the British people. The sword of state was returned to its secure storage with new security measures and enhanced symbolic status. Plans were announced for a special exhibition that would tell the story of its role in defending constitutional principles during the crisis. The ancient weapon had demonstrated that some symbols retain their power across centuries because they represent enduring principles rather than temporary political arrangements. As stability returned to Britain, the international implications of the crisis continued to unfold. Allied intelligence services used evidence gathered during the investigation to disrupt similar operations in their own countries. The conspiracy's failure in Britain had exposed methodologies and personnel, networks that could be tracked and neutralized before they could launch attacks elsewhere. The crisis had tested the monarchy's resilience in ways that no one could have anticipated, but it had also revealed strengths that even supporters of the institution had not fully appreciated. The combination of historical legitimacy, constitutional authority, and personal courage had proven more powerful than the technological sophistication and foreign resources deployed against it. The ancient institution had once again demonstrated its capacity to adapt and survive while maintaining its essential character and purpose. 6 months after the crisis that nearly destroyed the British monarchy, Queen Camilla stood once again in the vault beneath Windsor Castle, but this time she was not alone. King Charles stood beside her as they participated in a ceremony that would have been unimaginable before the events that tested their institution's very survival. The sword of state, which had played such a crucial role in defending the realm, was being formally rededicated in recognition of its service during the constitutional emergency. The ceremony was attended by representatives from across the Commonwealth, intelligence officials who had helped expose the conspiracy, and constitutional scholars who were still analyzing the legal precedents established during the crisis. The presence of so many witnesses transformed what could have been a simple ritual into a moment of profound historical significance, marking the monarchy's successful transition from crisis to renewal. The investigation into the conspiracy had revealed its full scope and international connections, leading to diplomatic consequences that continued to reverberate around the world. Several foreign intelligence officers had been expelled from Britain. Trade relationships with certain nations had been reassessed, and new international agreements on cybersecurity had been negotiated. The attack on the British monarchy had inadvertently strengthened democratic institutions worldwide by exposing vulnerabilities and forcing improvements in security protocols public. Support for the monarchy had stabilized at historically high levels. with opinion polls showing unprecedented appreciation for the institution's role in defending democratic principles. The crisis had educated citizens about constitutional principles they had previously taken for granted, creating a more informed and engaged public discourse about the monarchy's place in British society. Schools across the country now taught lessons about the recent crisis as an example of how democratic institutions could be threatened and defended. The legal consequences for the conspirators continued to unfold through the courts, with trials revealing additional details about the sophisticated nature of the plot. Several defendants had already been convicted of treason, receiving sentences that reflected the severity of their crimes against the constitutional order. The trials served as both justice and education, demonstrating to potential future conspirators that attacks on British institutions would be met with the full force of the law. Charles had implemented comprehensive reforms to royal security and communication systems, ensuring that the monarchy would never again be as vulnerable to coordinated attacks. New protocols established redundant communication channels, enhanced cybersecurity measures, and improved coordination with intelligence services. The reforms maintained the monarchy's traditional openness and accessibility while providing protection against sophisticated threats. The role of Queen Consort had been fundamentally redefined by Camilla's actions during the crisis. Constitutional experts had formalized new protocols that recognized the position's potential for independent action during extreme emergencies, while maintaining the traditional subordination to the monarch during normal circumstances. The changes reflected a more nuanced understanding of how the monarchy could function when normal chains of command were disrupted. International recognition of Camilla's leadership during the crisis had elevated her status within the global community. Foreign leaders who had previously viewed her as simply the king's wife now recognized her as a significant figure in her own right, capable of independent leadership and strategic thinking. This recognition had opened new opportunities for diplomatic engagement and international cooperation on behalf of British interests. The Sword of State itself had become an object of renewed fascination for historians and the public alike. The special exhibition telling the story of its role in the crisis had attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors, many of whom gained their first real understanding of the monarchy's constitutional significance. The ancient weapon had successfully bridged the gap between historical tradition and contemporary relevance, demonstrating how symbols could maintain their power across centuries. Academic research into the crisis had produced dozens of scholarly papers and books analyzing everything from the conspiracy's international connections to the constitutional precedents established by the counter-broadcast. Universities across the Commonwealth had established new courses examining the relationship between traditional institutions and modern security threats, using the recent crisis as a central case study. The personal impact on Charles and Camilla had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond their public roles. The experience of nearly losing the institution they had sworn to serve had deepened their commitment to its preservation and evolution. Their relationship had been strengthened by the shared experience of facing an existential threat and emerging victorious through courage and determination. The late Queen Elizabeth's emergency protocols, which had provided the constitutional framework for Camilla's actions, were now being studied and adapted by other constitutional monarchies. The foresight she had shown in preparing for such a crisis had saved not only the British monarchy but had provided a model for how traditional institutions could defend themselves against modern threats while maintaining their essential characters. The ceremony concluded and the Sword of State was returned to its place of honor. Camilla reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying morning when she had awakened to find herself alone in Windsor Castle. The woman who had once questioned her place within the royal family now possessed unshakable confidence in her ability to serve the crown and defend the principles it represented. The conspiracy that had sought to destroy the monarchy had instead revealed its enduring strength and relevance. The ancient institution had demonstrated its capacity to provide leadership during the most severe constitutional crises, while the personal courage of individuals willing to sacrifice everything for duty had proven more powerful than technological sophistication or foreign resources. Looking at the Sword of State in its specially lit case, Camilla understood that the weapon represented more than just historical continuity. It symbolized the ongoing responsibility of each generation to defend the principles inherited from their predecessors. The crisis had ended, but the vigilance required to protect democratic institutions would never cease. The monarchy had survived its greatest test since the English Civil War, emerging stronger and more relevant than its critics had believed possible. The ancient institution had once again proven its capacity to adapt and evolve while maintaining its essential purpose, serving as the constitutional foundation that allowed British democracy to flourish even in the face of sophisticated attempts to destroy it from within and without. As Charles and Camilla left the vault together, they carried with them the knowledge that they had not only preserved the monarchy for their own generation, but had strengthened it for future challenges that could not yet be imagined. The crown that had seemed so vulnerable just months earlier now stood as a beacon of institutional resilience and democratic stability in an increasingly uncertain world.